Our impressions of the Switch 2 in its first 7 months have been fairly positive, though we've had to judge the system's capabilities largely from visual output. But after examining the Switch 2 version of Assassin's Creed Shadows last month, we were able to sit down for an interview with key Ubisoft staff from the project. So what insights do the developers have from working with Switch 2? How did they manage to squeeze one of 2025's most technically accomplished games into a 10-watt handheld system? Shadows makes a few key visual concessions on Switch 2 that Alex and I wanted to get some insight into, following our first point of contact with AC Shadows on Nintendo's new hybrid. Let's start with lighting. RTGI has been chopped out of the game's presentation completely, which comes down to two factors primarily. Available memory is a key constraint, but the capability of Switch 2's GPU is also a concern, especially in portable mode. Switch 2 makes heavy use of the async compute queue as well, which starves the system of the GPU time that might otherwise be deployed towards RTGI. The other console platforms don't saturate async nearly as much. Fortunately, AC Shadows has a perfectly reasonable pre-calculated probe-based GI solution, which the Ubisoft developers have exhibited in a debug view in provided footage. Falling back to this system gave the developers an easy optimization win, and it made a lot of sense for this particular project. Most teams that ship RTGI these days don't put the effort in to maintain parallel GI solutions, but for Shadows at least, it seems like a good option. The GTAO, aka Ground Truth Ambient Occlusion, variant of SSAO, supplements the game's probe GI on other platforms, though it proved too expensive for Switch 2. Instead, Ubisoft implemented SSBC. Specular GI is handled using a mix of techniques on other consoles. Static local cube maps are used for some reflections, a dynamic cube map is generated from the player position, and screen space reflections are applied when reflected detail is in screen space. PS5 Pro can lean on ray-traced reflections in balanced and quality modes, but is otherwise reliant on the same systems. Switch 2 is a little different. SSR is excised completely, which is a concession to free up GPU time on Nintendo's hybrid. In docked mode, SSR takes up about 1 millisecond of frame time, which is doubled to about 2 milliseconds undocked. But when I spoke to the developers, they mentioned work was ongoing on SSR for Switch 2, and it could potentially be added in a future title update for docked mode, though portable mode was less certain. The cube maps got a bit of tweaking too. Local cube maps make the cut, but dynamic cube maps don't. Expect reduced cube map coverage on water bodies in particular, which makes them stick out in some scenes. Next, let's talk about the game's renowned simulation elements. The game's physics and world simulation mostly make the Switch 2 leap intact, but with fidelity gently pared back in a few areas. A lot of the team's examples here concerned the trees. Branches can no longer rotate under heavy winds, and vertex shaders used to animate the trees had to be simplified. The density of scattered objects in the wind has been reduced. Cloth and ropes behave similarly on Switch 2, except that they have fewer bones to animate, producing stiffer movement. Animations are still being driven by the same Atmos system that undergirds the other console platforms, just with certain animation constraints that limit the on-screen movement. The team described a lengthy process of tweaking and testing these systems to hopefully retain decent performance while maintaining Shadow's signature dynamism and interactivity. On the technical front, some of the game's simulation algorithms relied on the AVX2 vector instruction set, which required porting over to Neon for Switch 2, which is the ARM equivalent. Finally, there's the game's assets. One core system that is retained in similar form on Switch 2 is its micropolygon geometry, which does survive the T239 transition. This was a source of some anxiety for the team given that its removal would require heavily reworking the game's assets to accommodate a discrete LOD system. Bandwidth was flagged as an early concern, but it wasn't a major constraint in the final game. Like other systems, these utilize a mix of mesh shaders and compute shaders. But certain high-fidelity models have been stripped back, and high-grade texture assets have been removed. These assets were really intended to look good at 4K output, and on Switch 2, that level of quality isn't typically needed. The end result is a game that comes in at about half the size of its current generation console counterparts, at around 61 gigabytes for the launch version. That size is just about the reported maximum size of the standard Switch 2 game card, but uncertainty about the final size of the game install pushed Ubisoft towards a game keycard and download solution instead. But one key constraint kind of forced the team's hand in this situation. Cartridge data speeds were considered too low to feed the game. In the end, the team surmised that it would be extremely difficult or impossible to deliver a port of this quality while using a regular Switch 2 cartridge. And you can feel the impact of storage speed differences, even when we compare the game's supported storage formats. SD Express is noticeably slower to load than SSD, and about 7 seconds slower to load into our Kyoto save. Series S clears both by a large margin, but the Switch 2 shootout does favor internal storage. That said, the experience during gameplay feels very similar between the Switch 2 media, and in-game loading screens aren't common. It's really just the initial load and fast travel that are implicated here. Beyond the various cutbacks and visual minutiae, Assassin's Creed Shadows also diverges in image quality and upscaling solutions compared to the builds on other consoles. Series X, Series S, X, and PS5 use Anvil's built-in TAAU, while PS5 Pro users get a PSSR option as well. But Switch 2 uses NVIDIA's DLSS. The basic setup in Assassin's Creed Shadows is pretty familiar at this point for Switch 2. Portable mode resolves a 720p image using DLSS, which is then upscaled using a low-cost filter to the 1080p output on the portable screen. Internally, we're looking at about 600p maximum, with lows closer to 400p, according to the developers. Docked mode uses a 1080p DLSS output instead, with a maximum internal resolution of 900p. The team experimented with different upscaling techniques before settling on DLSS, including Anvil's own TAAU, which was cheaper than DLSS but came with certain quality compromises relative to NVIDIA's upscaler. TAAU produces decent quality at high resolutions, but breaks down substantially at the resolutions you'd need to contemplate on Switch 2. Our own tests suggest that this is probably a higher quality DLSS variant. Compared to the PC version running with DLSS 3.7, very similar kinds of stylization are evident in recently disoccluded areas of the image, suggesting a similar technique is in use. Likewise, note how the railings here have similar aliasing patterns between the two versions. Shadow's DLSS is being pushed pretty hard here, but it has more in common with the higher quality CNN DLSS available on PC than the DLSS Lite seen in other Switch 2 efforts, at least in our own testing. If this was one of the cheaper DLSS variants, we would expect to find poor quality or absent anti-aliasing in many areas of the frame, especially on the edges of characters and other fast-moving image elements. I think the final results look pretty good in the shipping product, which is a sentiment echoed by the Shadows Switch 2 team. They seemed surprised by the kinds of resolutions they could ship in portable mode, in particular, without producing a poor-looking image, which they attributed to the smaller screen. I would always prefer to lose a bit of clarity in service of a more stable image, so I think the choices here do pay off. Unfortunately, the game does have some substantial performance quirks at the moment. The chief concern is poor frame pacing, which is a substantial drag on the docked experience. Shadows devs think the issue comes down to operating at too tight a frame time margin on the Switch 2, as over-budget frames are more common on the hybrid system. Interestingly, this is something the developers didn't seem to be fully keyed into until our first video on the Switch 2 version dropped. It's a curious issue because frame time problems seem to be present even in lighting rendering workloads, where you would assume frame budgets would be less stressed. In any case, this is something the developers are planning to look at more closely, with the potential to address it in future updates. But handheld mode largely sidesteps this concern. Here the developers use VRR with low framerate compensation to achieve a more stable framerate, because their 30 FPS framerate target is beneath the 40Hz VRR minimum the Switch 2 screen appears to have. But the screen is being driven with a maximum refresh of 60Hz here, not 120Hz. Usually the display should operate at 60Hz, with dips below occurring when the game's framerates drop. The developers are talking with Nintendo about LFC VRR on Switch 2, so hopefully we can see a system-level resolution of this problem soon. So far, I've mostly been using footage I banked from around AC Shadow's launch, which still generally matches the current version of the game. But patch 1.1.7, which dropped on December 17th last year, does pack some optimizations. We can find in this opening cutscene comparison, for instance, that the updated Switch code maintains a slightly faster clip than its launch era counterpart. A few especially taxing shots in this intro sequence suggest a better 30 FPS adherence as of the latest patch. That's a positive sign, even if Shadow still has bouts of sub 30 FPS performance at times. But the game's most basic performance concern, poor frame pacing and virtually all game content, hasn't been fixed. Fast traversal can sometimes provoke small stutters as well. At the moment, it's easy to recommend Shadows as a portable experience, but discerning players will demand smoother output docked. I don't have time to test this patch thoroughly, but quick impressions suggest a visually similar experience, albeit at a higher performance level that is evident in especially taxing moments. Overall, I think Shadows is a solid effort on Switch 2. Most of this video has been spent discussing visual downgrades, but it doesn't feel like an axe has been taken to this game. Despite a range of concessions to fit the hardware, the core visual experience has been maintained. This is a massive open-world current-gen title, and not that much has been lost in translation to a small handheld with older NVIDIA tech. In conversation, the pain points of the Switch 2 porting process seem to come down to memory capacity, memory bandwidth, and general GPU capability, especially in portable mode. On the plus side, the Switch 2's relatively modern GPU, easy-to-use SDK, and DLSS support all earned developer plaudits. One developer commented that the hardware was a pleasure to work with, despite its limitations. But the Switch 2 porting process seems to be a lot easier if you build your game with the Switch 2 hardware in mind from the outset. Shadows has a very scalable engine, which helped to facilitate this port in spite of late development. Developers' familiarity with other consoles was also fingered as a potential sticking point. Shaders that work great on RDNA-based Xboxes or PlayStations can really drag on Switch 2, and may need tweaks for the different architecture. Assassin's Creed Shadows is a technically brilliant game, and its Switch 2 port is typically excellent. If Ubisoft developers' comments are anything to go by, we're going to see many more demanding Switch 2 ports this generation. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at patreon.com/digitalfoundry for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media.